Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ali Hassamul Haq and I am the Director for the Center of Law and Technology here at the Ziauddin Faculty of Law. Today we're going to be discussing a topic of global and national importance, and that is the protection of personal data. To help me with this discussion is a dear friend, a former colleague, and a brilliant lawyer and data protection officer based out of Brussels in Belgium, Mr. Sorin Berbece. Sorin, thank you so much for your time and for being here with us today.
Thank you, Ali, and it is my pleasure to be here at Ziauddin Faculty of Law, and it's nice to see you after all this time.
The pleasure is all mine. So, Sorin, before we delve into the topic of data protection, let's first analyze what comes under the garb of personal data.
Indeed, so this concept of personal data is very broad, as you may know. It encompasses any piece of information that can directly or indirectly identify you. So you can refer it to as a name, surname, address, or even an IP address.
I see, because the IP address links to your geographical location where you're based out of. And I believe your computer's MAC address also adds on to that. Any app tracking data for your location, for your your IMEI number for your cell phone, or your MAC address for your computer. Basically any information that relates back to you, be it your name, your CNIC number, your tax number, your health records, any political or religious affiliations, anything essentially that can be studied and you can be found as the subject to which that data pertains. Is that correct?
Precisely. Any information that leads back to you, that will be personal data.
All right. Okay. So why is the protection of personal data deemed to be important?
Well, I think we can start by explaining how personal data, the right to protection of personal data came about. At a certain point, it branched out of the right to privacy. So the right to privacy is basically the right to avoid any state interference in your personal affairs. Now, this right, over the time, has helped us to maintain our privacy of correspondence and our privacy in our domicile. As time passed by, a lot of technologies have emerged that now made it possible to process a lot of personal data, a lot of information about yourself in an automatic way.
Big data, if I'm not mistaken.
Big data, indeed. So as you had the internet and a lot of devices such as your phone that require a lot of your personal data, there was a need to come up with a new right to branch out of the right of privacy and protect the processing of personal data by automated means.
I see. All right. So it stems from the right to privacy, and it percolates into this digital realm. And a reason behind that, what a lot of academics and commentators have said, is that similar to how we have and still do interact with our physical environment, with our workplace, with our place of residence, we similarly interact in perhaps a much more open and honest way in the digital realm with certain technologies that we use to gain information, to access the internet, to use for our work, for instance, or whatever it might be. And so that realm has also now been included into a sort of if you can compare the analogy with the digital realm, is now as important, if not more important, than your physical space that you occupy, because you seem to interact with your devices with the frame of mind that nobody else is actually looking. And based on that interaction, and it's very important to note that it's not only interaction with your devices, it's how much do you interact with them, what times do you interact with them, what purposes do you interact with them with. Are you going on social media? Are you searching for certain work-related purposes? So the psychological relationship between you and your device has become very, very linked. But even so, a lot of people have said, and I'd like your opinion on this matter, they've said that, well, we have nothing to hide. Why should we worry about protecting our personal data? Why should we be concerned about having privacy in the digital realm? What would you say about that?
Well, that is, let's say, an unfortunate rhetoric that keeps popping up in the digital environment as well. Of course, you do have people that say, yes, I have nothing to hide, and that might be true. But even if you do have nothing to hide, it doesn't mean that you don't have to respect the right to privacy. It doesn't mean that the right to privacy should not be guaranteed as such. And I might use the words of Edward Snowden, a famous whistleblower who uncovered a conspiracy, I might say, or the operations, the covert operations of the US surveillance. So he said, okay, saying that you don't care about the right of privacy because you have nothing to hide. It's nothing more than saying you don't care about the freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. So if you draw this analogy, you come to realize that the nothing to hide argument does not help society at all. It is a flawed argument.
Right, I agree with that, and that's quite a cheeky comment by Mr. Snowden. But I happen to agree with that analogy drawn between those two concepts. But well, then, in the light of more and more companies wanting to collect your data in return for free services, because that's the business model that's emerged, right? Like you have, I wouldn't want to name any social media companies, but that's their main model. They offer the services for free, but in return, you are the commodity that they sell. They sell your likes, your dislikes, essentially the profile that they create of you, your psychological profile, your professional profile, your personal profile, and it's all profiled and put together in a neat little stack, and that's what they sell. So if we sort of try to disrupt that model, what would that mean for digital services in the future?
That's a very good question. So, what would mean is probably they would start charging us. But the question is, do we want that? I mean, would you like to pay for Google.com search engine? I wouldn't. Would you like to pay for Google location? I think the issue here is to what extent the users are aware of how their information is used. Because, of course, these services are profit making and they need to make an income. So, they turn to you and they ask you for your data. Most of the times you just scroll around and click accept, but you don't know to what you're consenting to. So what it would mean is, first of all, users should be more aware of the data they're giving away, the extent of all the data they're giving away, like you said, your IP address, your email, your likes, your dislikes, basically your profile. Your activity online is reduced to a profile that is then sold by these companies to advertisers that in turn sell your data in real-time bidding platforms. That in turn is monetized, and that in turn is will target you back with advertisements, and very, very precise advertisements, because the more precise the profile they have on you, the more precise advertisements you'll get. It's no secret that you've looked for flights, let's say to Bali, and then you went on Facebook and you saw, advertisements, hotels in Bali. So this is possible. This is made possible by the algorithms that these platforms have put in place.
Oh yes.
So what it would mean to drop the freemium model, we would probably have to start paying for it. Also, there is another option, maybe to look for other business models. And I see that more and more products are appearing on the market. They brand themselves as privacy friendly, and most of them are. To name a few, and without advertising for them, I would probably use DuckDuckGo as a search engine, and Proton Mail as a mail service. What's next? Well, we'll probably have to see. Who knows? Maybe we'll end up paying by cryptocurrency. Maybe while using a service, that service will introduce a crypto miner on our computer that will in turn mine a cryptocurrency while we use the service. This could be another business model. We're just brainstorming here, but this is just to give an example of how things can evolve.
That's fantastic. So essentially, while you're using their service, they're using your computer's processing power to mine cryptocurrency, which in turn sort of pays for the service that you're using. Oh, that's diabolically brilliant, Mr. Sorin. That's fantastic. But I like the approach that you took, was that so we don't need to go towards a strict protection of data. That means personal data can be disseminated as and when required. Just the user or the data subject needs to be aware of what data is collected and how that data is used, processed, controlled, and further sold or passed on to third parties. Essentially, what I gather from this is that it's all about knowledge, about knowing where your data is and how it's being controlled. Is that so?
Indeed.
All right. So, but then, we have a very recent example of WhatsApp's privacy policy, which has been amended quite significantly. And the interesting part about that is that it's different for users in the EU than it is from users outside the EU. And specifically in Pakistan, they've written it in very clear, unequivocal terms that they're going to be collecting your IP data, your location, GPS location, your IMEI number, your mobile hardware data, and what software you're running the program on. And this, it seems, is unnecessary data that is being collected by this company, because they don't really require this information to provide the services that they provide to you. Because what I've noticed with other apps is that they collect the data which is imperative or which is required to offer you the service that that app or service is providing. But WhatsApp seems to be deviating from this model. There seems to be no rules being followed, and you see the selective terms of privacy being implemented in the EU and being implemented outside the EU. I mean, this sort of seems like almost like a blackmail of a service, that, you know, if you want to utilize the service, you accept the terms. If you don't want to utilize it and you don't accept the terms, you can't utilize it.
Precisely. Let me draw a parallel, because I think it's better to. I'll address the EU side, and then you'll address the Pakistani law side. So in the EU, you have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This piece of legislation requires you to follow certain strict provisions. So you would need to abide of some principles, such as the data minimization principle, that you would only process the data that are necessary to for that processing activity. You'll need to process it in a fair way. You need to be transparent about the way you process that information. You need to keep that information secure as well. You need to have a precise purpose when you process that data as well. So you have all these principles, and then you have to respect all these principles, plus you need one legal basis. Of course, the most common one is consent, but consent has its requirements. It has to be free, informed, specific, and unambiguous. And if you process sensitive data, such as your political beliefs, your religious standings, you need to have an explicit consent as well. So that is only one legal basis. You'll have consent, you'll have legitimate interest, in which you will no longer require consent, but you will say that I do have the legitimate interest to process the data. But this entails a prerequisite assessment. You need a legitimate interest assessment, you know, to balance the rights that you have against the rights of users. Another legal basis that is very interesting is the performance of a contract. And like you said, most of the apps will require only the data they need to perform that service. Of course, turning back to WhatsApp, from a EU perspective, they do not need the IMEA, they do not need the GPS location to perform that service. So this leaves them with the legal basis of consent. Now, how will they do it in the EU? We'll have to see, because as they've done it in the past, you'll probably be presented with a take it or leave it offer. You will only have the option to say okay, or otherwise you will no longer be able to use the service. Or that is a forced consent, and that is not in line with the GDPR. I'm curious to see how Pakistani law addresses this, because as I understand, there is only a draft of the right to protection of personal data, so this probably would leave us with another right, and I look forward to hearing what right might protect users in this WhatsApp affair.
Absolutely. And what I notice, you've sort of answered the question as well within your answer, and that is that the EU has the GDPR. They have legislation in place which is regulating the use and processing of data, and under what conditions you can use and process data. However, we don't have any laws enacted as acts of parliament yet, or ordinances for that matter, in terms of the data of personal data protection. However, we do have a personal data protection bill, but it's been in the process of being discussed and mulled over since 2018. And in light of the WhatsApp situation, stakeholders have realized that there's a critical requirement for data protection regulation in Pakistan. And having a look at the bill and having compared it to the GDPR, there are some provisions which are a bit more onerous. There's some provisions which are a bit less onerous. But overall, the bill as it is, if it is passed into legislation, would be an effective step forward, and at least would create a first legal protection of your data, because companies like WhatsApp then will not be able to create these arbitrary policies which they enforce upon you. Because you see, in the EU, you still have the option right? They will ask you. They won't force it upon you. They won't just give you a unilateral terms of service or a privacy policy that goes against the GDPR. So they have to somehow justify it. However, in Pakistan, we don't have that legal fortification or protection at this point, which is what led to this company creating such an absurd privacy policy in which they're taking all the data that they don't even need, and to what ends? Who's to say? And that leads to a lack of trust in these companies and corporations as well, because I mean, we've all read George Orwell, and we've seen that it's what starts off as a small snowball, snowballs into an avalanche, and at the end, before you know it, you might end up in a hyper surveilled sort of environment. Not necessarily government surveillance, but surveilled in the sense that none of your digital information is kept secret or kept private or kept secured. And that is quite concerning for users, and as I'm sure was concerning for people in the EU, which is why they passed the GDPR. But surveillance is something that really concerns me, and as I'm sure it concerns a lot of members of our audience as well. So would you care to shed some light on the aspect of surveillance and how such things may snowball into being in a state of hyper surveillance if we don't curb it now?
Indeed, Ali, and thanks for bringing surveillance on the table. Before we, discuss about state surveillance, I think it's important to equally understand what corporate surveillance is. That corporate surveillance occurs with all these big companies like the likes of Facebook or Google or even Apple. So they amass a lot of data, so they know a lot of information about yourself. Now, the way they choose to use this data can qualify as a corporate surveillance. If they just pass on the data, informing the user properly, and just doing it to provide the service, that is fine. But that in turn, the data is then, of course, shared with advertisers. And a lot of sensitive data is shared with advertisers. And I'll give a worrying example. You have a lot of apps that process your sensitive data. There are apps that track the periods of women. There are apps that track your heartbeat. All this information goes to advertisers that in turn create a profile about yourself. So in a way, advertisers will gather a lot of data about you from a lot of other points, from a lot of apps. So they will have a more sophisticated profile about you than you will know yourself. They'll have a lot of data, and they will infer a lot of data from that data, and they will know a lot about yourself than you probably do. So that is what I would call a corporate surveillance. That is used, of course, for profit-making purposes. They use it to amass data, but it can also be used to influence decisions. So a social media platform might use certain algorithms to target you only with ads or information that they think you would like based on your previous searches. So that kind of keeps you in a filter bubble where you'll be surrounded only by the things that you like or you believe in. And you will no longer have access to the internet as it was before all this came about. That is corporate surveillance, and that is a very, very serious threat to democracy. We've seen what happened with Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've seen how elections can be, an election's fate can be changed only by the use of social media, where users were targeted with political ads based on their affiliations. So that is corporate surveillance. Now,
if I'm not mistaken, they had millions of users' data, and each user they had around 3,000 data points on. On the basis of those 3,000 data points, they created one profile for one person, and then they had it for millions of users. And I think that's very concerning as well, because this shows that it's now percolating not into an advertisement model, but also on a narrative control model and shaping narratives a certain way, and which people from the military-industrial complex like to call fifth-generation warfare. Because if a person has information about your psychological proclivities, your worldview, your inhibitions, your things you're fond of, then of course, slowly but surely, your thinking may be molded in a certain direction by giving you content which sort of shapes it to that direction. And that's a very concerning thing for all countries, because this dilutes the fortification of your own worldview or of your narrative that your country or your belief system is trying to protect. And if corporations are given this power and control, or if in fact as a sort of ancillary consequence they get this power, it becomes a source of big concern, because what if they inform you that your data will be used to be profiling you and will be used to do XYZ, reach XYZ objective? Who's to put a cap on that? Who's to stop that from snowballing into something that we had never, even perceived beforehand?
Indeed, Ali, it becomes problematic. And so you have like corporate surveillance that allows them to amass a great deal of power and to basically shape your future in a way. And this gives them not only the power to play with your personal data, but also, it has freedom of speech implications. And we've seen lately how social media and platforms have deplatformed apps such as Parler and have banned accounts of users. That's another aspect. So they have amassed this power thanks to processing a lot of personal data, and now they're shifting towards other rights, fundamental rights, such as the freedom of speech. Now, from corporate surveillance, we can move to state surveillance. What is state surveillance? Well, you have a different actor now that processes a lot of information about its citizen, and that is the state, the government, or the surveillance agencies. Now, why would the state need to know all that information? Of course, I understood in case of companies they were doing it for profit making, but what would be the state's benefit to process all that information about its citizen when the role of the state was to protect its citizen? So in a way, this reminds me of a panopticon, a circular prison where you have a guard in the middle that has access, has a clear view on every person that is jailed. But you don't really need to see all that people at the same time. You just have to create this appearance so that the person that is being locked will always think that is being watched. So in a way, if we apply this to state surveillance, we know that a state could always be watching us, even if it doesn't. But this creates an infringement of your right to privacy and protection of personal data. This makes you behave in a way that you wouldn't behave otherwise, because you know you're being watched. This is why George Orwell called this concept as Big Brother. You know there is someone who is always watching you or could be watching you. And of course, they're doing it for power purposes. You have more power over your citizens, then you call the shots and you remain in power. You know what they think, what they like, what they're afraid of. You can play with this personal data for your own purposes. When an election is coming up, you could speculate the fears that these people have and just win the elections again.
Oh dear, that's very concerning, and I sometimes fear that perhaps science fiction paves the way, and we often take that route and make it our reality, even though it's something that we've all been, very apprehensive about as a future for ourselves. But inevitably we make it our future,
Indeed,
because of how afraid we are of it.
Indeed, and that future is now in certain countries. To give an example, in China, you have a social credit scoring system. What happens is that the Chinese government processes a lot of information about their citizens, either from apps or directly from them. And everything is processed. If you've paid your fines, if you jaywalked, if you did this, if you did that, you have a lot of cameras on the street. They use facial recognition. The state can actually see whether you cross the street in a right way, and you could be fined for that. And not only this, but this social credit scoring system gives you a certain score based on the actions that you perform in a day-to-day basis. If you've posted something bad about the Chinese government, of course, your score will drop. And what happens if your scores drop beneath a certain level? You will no longer have access to certain services or products. So I think just 2 years ago, 7 million people no longer had access to buying plane and train tickets because their social credit score was too low, because they've posted bad things on social media, because they didn't pay their fines, they didn't pay their credits or loans, or you name it.
That's ridiculous to think about. But for a second, I also want to play devil's advocate. And let's see that, okay, there's country X, which it's a huge country, it has 1.5 billion people. And how to control or govern 1.5 billion people is a very big problem. And in terms of governance, such large amounts of people can do a large amount of things that you just can't foresee, and you can't sort of expect them to act in a civilized or sociable manner. And so you have to set certain social rules and make sure that those social rules are enforced, following the law, maintaining the status quo, not writing against the status quo, not creating discord or disharmony in society, abiding by civic laws, by abiding by criminal and civil laws. And so in order to do that, there's a mechanism that is created to make sure that everyone does in fact abide by all laws, and that will ensure uniformity. So on playing devil's advocate, it serves a huge function, that is social cohesion. And so do the means justify these ends, is the real question, I suppose, that emerges.
Well, I think in this case the answer would be no. Do you want a government to control you or to govern you? Yes, you need to abide laws, but you have authorities that do that. And what is the sanction for, let's say, not paying your fine? Of course, you get another fine, but this should be it. On the other hand, what happens in China is, if you do not respect certain provisions, not only that you'll get the penalty of the law, but you also lose access to services that should be guaranteed, that should have nothing to do with breaching the law. I mean, let's face it, we've all done things that are more or less against the law, like minor things maybe. Yes, I was driving my car and I didn't stop at the red light. I should be sanctioned for this. But that should be it, On the other hand, what happens is that, people are removed from society slowly if their score drops beneath a certain level. And there is an episode in a very interesting series. I'm forgetting the name right now.
Black Mirror?
Black Mirror, indeed.
I had a feeling.
Black Mirror. That episode actually talks about this, having a certain score. It's, I think, from 1 to 5. And if you fall beneath a certain score, you no longer have access to certain products or to certain loans.
I see. So the avalanche effect, the snowball effect, can lead to a sort of hyper surveillance state that we've seen. Yes. And this all stems from disregarding the right to privacy at its very core.
Indeed. And thank you for mentioning the right to privacy, because we were talking in the beginning on how the right to protection of personal data branched out from the right to privacy. And later on, we talked about what can Pakistani law do to protect against this WhatsApp affair. And I do believe that Pakistani law has the right to privacy enshrined. So this could be a bigger umbrella that could be used to protect the right to protection of personal data, because that is the case in most of the countries which don't have a specific legislation. It goes back to its origins. We'll protect this under the right of privacy. Even in Europe, you have the European Convention of Human Rights that only mentions the right to privacy, because in the 1950s, when it was drafted, you had no right to protection of personal data. That appeared later in the 1970s. So you could still use that provision, to protect your privacy and personal data.
And I believe it was codified for the first time in the EU in 1996 via the Personal Data Protection Directive.
Indeed. But in its initial shape, it was first enacted as a distinct right in the 1970s in Germany. So you see, the EU has come a long way from the right to privacy to protection of personal data. I hope so, and I'm sure Pakistan will do the same.
One can only hope, because there have been some instances that personal data has been misused in Pakistan. And not to name any companies, but a very, very significantly popular ride app, like ride-sharing app, and one food delivery app, and some mobile network service providers. This is all published information, by the way. All the data that they had secured or were holding was hacked and fell into the wrong hands. So this wasn't a legitimate or a willful exchange of data as data protection regulations or laws overlook, but this was the illegitimate infiltration into a data system and then data taken or stolen from that and put on the dark web for sale, and it's currently there. Apparently, this Dubai-based company called Reuters had published that perhaps 150 million Pakistanis' personal data is currently available on the dark web for sale, and for as low as $1 or $2 per person. This includes their name, last name, their address, their phone number, their GPS pin location, their CNIC number, as well as their national tax number. And so that, in a way, is enough information for identity theft to take place and identity fraud to take place. And we've had an increasing number of cases with identity theft and fraud, and people have been using and misusing this information to sort of, fool other people into giving more of their information so that they can access their bank accounts. And then banks had to respond to that by adding 2-step and 3-step verification processes and continuously sending you reminder messages and emails that the bank will officially never call you for information because the bank already holds your information. But another interesting thing, banks which have your information are legally allowed to sell that information to other banks or other advertisers, like you said. So in fact, a few days ago, I got a call from a bank which I have never personally visited, much less opened an account, and never opened an account, never visited. And they had all of my details with them. They called me by my full name. I got the call on my cell phone, and they asked me if I wanted to utilize their credit card services. I said, "How do you know I can even afford your credit card services?" He's like, "Sir, you earn this much." I said, "How is that data available to you?" And obviously that salesperson didn't respond, didn't have an answer to that. Said that, "Sir, I'm very sorry, but I've just been given a number of people I have to call today and to sort of pitch my credit card to them. That's all I'm at liberty to say. I don't personally know where the bank got this data from. But somebody knew and somebody informed this bank, and I'm assuming they took money for selling that data to them, which was very, very concerning. So, but this leads me to go into a bit of a tangent, which is that so data protection laws and regulations only do so much because they govern the legitimate use and processing and collection of data. However, there's an entire different side to this, which is the illegitimate use of it, which comes under sort of the garb of cybersecurity then. Because how do you protect certain online servers and databases, which I mean, of course, the law is very much there for the legitimate use, but how do you prevent illegitimate access into those things? And as far as my research goes, I have not yet seen a single jurisdiction in which data protection regulation includes cybersecurity regulation as a part of it. And I am of the humble opinion that I think this nexus is extremely important to have data protection laws whilst having cybersecurity provisions in place, or setting at least the base minimum threshold of cybersecurity measures that you should have to protect a server. What would you think about that?
That is a very good idea, Ali. Indeed, they should be embedded. So cybersecurity provisions should be embedded per se in a data protection regulation. However, we live in a digital world that has an exponential increase. So whatever protection measures worked 1 year ago, they might not be appropriate today. You have hackers with great skills that keep finding loopholes, and then you have people on the cybersecurity front that keep finding remedies to this. So either by antiviruses or standard operating procedures to protect personal data. For instance, how to secure a database, how many people should access a certain database, what their credentials are, what hardware should you use, what is the location of that database, should you put it underground, or should you disclose that location to everyone in your privacy policy. So I think that's one of the reasons why you cannot actually put all the cybersecurity provisions in a data protection regulations, because they will soon be out of date. So instead, for instance, the GDPR has only mentioned that you should put in place appropriate technical and organizational measures. What appropriate means, of course, can change. So that's why you need to look in other pieces of legislation, such as the EU Cybersecurity Directive, or international standards, such as the 27001 standard that is a very common used in the cybersecurity world. And I'm glad that you mentioned the illegal use of data, because This is also reflected in the General Data Protection Regulation. For instance, if you fail to tell the user the exact purpose for which you're processing certain data, or if you just do not abide that purpose, you will be sanctioned. That is an illegal use, and it is sanctioned as such. Now you go one step, and you'll find hackers that indeed breach databases and steal your data. And how do you address this? Of course, with cybersecurity. What can we do about it as citizens? Well, I encourage everyone to look at having an antivirus. You will need an antivirus. VPN protection would be welcome because it does allow it to encrypt your traffic and hide your real IP in case a hacker decides to target your IP address. So this is what a VPN is used for. It's not per se an illegal service. It does help you. It's a cybersecurity measure that people should know about.
I see, but you see, with countries like Pakistan, we have some unique problems that we can't fix using the same brush that the EU used. And on the forefront of this issue is terrorism, and has been for a number of years. And although currently in 2021, sitting here today, we can safely say that the situation is not nearly as bad as it was way back when. But even so, the use, legitimate or illegitimate, of the internet, you have to keep in mind that certain non-beneficial actors will be accessing the internet, actors which don't have benevolent intentions, and so to allow these means, people using VPNs, which is, by the way, not allowed in Pakistan because the relevant regulatory authority asks you to register your VPN with them in order to continue using those services, so that they know which person is using a virtual proxy network, and for what purposes are they using it. Are they doing it for business? Are they doing it for cybersecurity? Or are they doing it for other illegitimate purposes? And so the main argument that stakeholders here bring forward in terms of allowing people this digital security is to say that, well, who's going to regulate or govern or look over the use of the internet and other online services by non-state actors which don't have benevolent intentions. And so that's a wicked problem we're currently facing, and nobody really has a clear answer on how to address this. Because on one hand, we do enjoy the right of privacy and the freedom of speech, and to have certain cybersecurity measures which would keep us on par with the international environment. But on the other hand, you have people saying that, well, if we allow this or we give them a free hand, then you have, and in the past they have been uncovered child pornography rings, human trafficking rings, drug trafficking networks, terrorism networks, and they've been using the digital realm to further propagate their horrid plans. And so that puts our law enforcement agencies in a very precarious position, which is why the general trend that we see with the legislative sort of framework in Pakistan is that it leans more towards oversight. It leans more towards control, rather than governance, or rather than allowing free access into these services. And so, I mean, I know it's a very analytical point which is very specific to Pakistan, but such wicked problems, what would you think could be done in such a situation? Of course, nobody really has an answer to this question, but since we're brainstorming, any answer is the right answer at this point.
Well, I think there are certain angles that you could explore. You have an ethical angle, such as why would the state presume that everyone intends to commit an act of terrorism or indulge into child pornography and such? We know these are probably exceptions rather than the rule, so why would you frame them as the rule and ban a VPN service because of that reason? In the EU, yes, we also fight against terrorism and child pornography, but we do that on an exception basis. So if the law enforcement authorities have a very good suspicion that a certain individual might be behind acts of terrorism, they can, of course, reach out to that service provider. So we were discussing why the Pakistani government has chosen to ban probably the VPN service, because it can be used for illegal purposes. And I was saying, from an ethical perspective, why would you presume that everyone tends to commit a criminal offense?
So it's this exception rather than the
Exactly.
rule, yeah.
So you should have you should draw a distinction, because that service also have legal uses, and as I have mentioned, it can protect you against informatic attacks. and it also helps you encrypt your data. Now, the law can, of course, state as an exception if they have a very good suspicion that someone might be using that service for a criminal purpose intent, then you can reach out to the service provider and ask them to hand over the data. I think this is how it should be dealt with. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where a service will be banned, although, of course, it has good purposes. And I'll draw an analogy. A knife can be used to cut bread, but also to kill a person. What would you do in this case? You ban the use of knives altogether?
Very well made, Sorin. Point very well made. So that reminds me of one of these quotes that I read, that technology in general is morally neutral. And that also reminds me of this other quote about the rule of law, that the rule of law is also like a sharp-edged knife. And I mean, you can use it to be cut in either direction. It's morally neutral by itself, like a gun is. Guns don't kill people. People kill people.
Exactly.
So similarly, the analogy, I really liked that. But on that note, I think we'll sort of conclude today's discussion. It's been very entertaining and enlightening to have this discussion with you. I thank you very much for your time once again, and hopefully academics such as yourself will be able to shed more light on these wicked problems which are faced specifically by certain countries which haven't been able to enter into the realm of understanding or implementing data protection laws and rules and regulations. So thank you so much for your time, Sorin.
Thank you, Ali, and I'll do my best. And thank you for having me here.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Stay tuned to this space.